Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 8 of our food systems seminar on food supply chains during the COVID-19 pandemic. So before we get into it, just a couple of announcements for our class. We are in week 8, which means we are somehow close to the end of the quarter. So just a quick reminder to the Nutrition 400 students that you have 2 more weekly submissions that are available to you. And that's after this week, seminar 8, and then after next week, seminar 9. A reminder that we will only count your top 5 seminar reflections. So if you're happy with your assessment so far, you don't need to submit any more, but you are welcome to do so. And even if you are very happy with your assessment so far, remember that Nutrition 400 students are still required to hand in a final paper. And that final assignment is due on Monday, March 15th, and it's worth 50% of your final grade. So you do need to submit it in order to be eligible for the seminar credit. Nutrition 500 students, your final assignment is coming up, your one assignment is coming up, and a reminder that we have collapsed the 2 one-page papers into just one single submission that we're expecting that is also due on Monday, March 15th. Details for all of this is on Canvas, and we really look forward to continuing to read the reflections of our undergraduate students and then also to get to hear from our graduate students in the seminar. Okay, enough about that. Let's get to the topic at hand. And as we do, we start off again with our familiar framework of food systems. And this is again pulled from the Food and Agriculture Organization. And we've been using this schematic all quarter. And this is actually very similar to the highlighting that we did last week for the seminar, where we said we were going to focus more on some of the drivers and influences of the food supply chain and what we often consider as the food system, the food supply chain, the food environment, and ultimately the nutrition and health outcomes. But of course, we're also going to be focusing on some of the influences that we can pull from the Sustainable Development Goals, and then the political, program, and institutional actions that flow from those type of goals. And of course, the SDGs are global goals, but we often see them playing out in locales around this country and countries around the world. So I think we'll start to see some more connections to those international goals and start to think about some of the program and policy drivers of our food system here in Washington State. Because today we get to hear from one of the leads of our Washington Food Policy Forum. And so I'm so pleased to introduce our speaker for the day. We have Laura Raymond joining us from the Washington State Department of Agriculture. Laura is the Washington State Department of Agriculture Regional Markets Program Manager. And Laura has worked in food and ag for over 20 years in a whole variety of roles, everything from community gardens to multi-farm CSAs, or community supported agriculture. And now Laura works more to provide technical assistance and civil service policy work. I think this will be of interest to our very multidisciplinary class, that Laura has a background in international geography and global food systems, and that she's now working hyper locally. And she coupled that global perspective and that BA in geography with an MBA in sustainable business. And with that incredible diversity of backgrounds, I'm so pleased to welcome you, Laura. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite you to start sharing yours. Thank you so much for being here.
Great, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. I want to just make sure that my screen is sharing appropriately. Okay, good, we're good to go. Thanks for that introduction. Yeah, it's been a bit of a circuitous path, but a wonderful one in terms of what my interests and career alignment has been to get me to this place. So if I have any words of introduction to the students that are watching this today, it's follow your interests and and even things that you're challenged by. If you really love the work and are willing to work hard at it, there is frequently a good fit, even if it's not something you always imagined at the get-go. That's just based on my personal experience. So yes, I work for the Regional Markets Program at the Washington State Department of Agriculture. And I thought I would just take a little bit of time today to give you a little bit of an overview of what that program does. The state government and departments of agriculture can be big and somewhat opaque, and I think it can be helpful to have a little glimpse into what some of the different activities and roles are within the agency. And then I'm going to shift into talking just generally about food policy and food policy councils or food policy forums, and then talk a bit specifically about the Washington Food Policy Forum and some of the work that the forum here in Washington State has been doing over the past several years, and particularly this year in the pandemic and the COVID-19 situation. So with that, I'll just get started. The Regional Markets Program is actually made up of two interrelated programs: the Small Farm Direct Marketing Assistance, Technical Assistance Program, and Farm to School. And the idea of these two programs working closely together is that they support the economic viability of small and direct marketing farms in Washington State and increase the availability of Washington-grown products in schools, institutions, and on tables. And we do that in a whole variety of ways. So we provide technical assistance primarily to farmers and small food businesses, but also to institutions like schools and university food service who are wanting, or even restaurants, people who are wanting to buy directly from local farms. And that's a different way of doing business than, for example, calling a large national distributor. And so sometimes they need technical assistance in how to make that fit work. We do a little bit of sort of more traditional marketing and promotion type activities, a lot of outreach and education, especially on regulations and requirements that can otherwise be a barrier for small farmers for accessing markets, to understand what are the requirements to, say, sell my eggs at the farmer's market. What do I need to know? So we do a lot of that kind of guidance and education. We develop a lot of resources to help us in that work. Some of them are online. Probably one of our most well-known is this one right in the center of the screen, called the Handbook for Small and Direct Marketing Farms. It's a collection of fact sheets that really goes through a lot of that information I was just mentioning. Say I want to sell cut flowers, and I want to sell cut flowers via a subscription service where I deliver to people's homes directly. What do I need to know to make sure I'm doing that within the scope of the law? So you can go to the fact sheet on here on cut flowers and get at least an introduction to what you need to know. A lot of farms know our agency because of this book, and many people call it the Green Book because it has been green in all of its various volumes. So these are some images to give you a sense of what our work looks like. When we're doing technical assistance trainings and events around the state, we really rely a lot on creating opportunities for peer-to-peer learning, for farmers to learn from each other. And for food service directors, or a lot of people know them as lunch ladies, the people who make school lunches for kids, they're teaching each other about how to work with fresh ingredients from local farms, for example. So these are just some images from those types of events around the state. And here's some specifically related to farm to school connections. The photos that you see there of kids with apples is something we do every year to highlight local food, local products in schools. And it's called the Great Washington Apple Crunch. And at noon, everybody who wants to take part on the same day, we all crunch a Washington apple together. So it's just a really fun way to get some of that engagement and thinking about where food comes from. And then we also do a lot of work on what we call regional supply chain development. So I think in this course, you've been starting to understand a little bit more about the concept of supply chains and supply chains in food, how food makes its way from a farm as a raw agricultural product to something that you might buy in a grocery store, and how those food chains might be very local. In my neighborhood in Seattle, there are a handful of urban gardens, even a CSA. I could get my food from my own neighborhood, at least some of it, but then some of my food is literally traveling the world through very complex supply chains. So when we talk about regional supply chain development and market access, we're trying to do what we can to build relationships in a lot of cases, and also look at physical infrastructure, small scale processing plants, commercial kitchens, refrigerated trucks, the types of things that are needed to support a local or more regional supply chain. And we offer a lot of referrals and business support for small farms and food businesses. We're often just a first place to call when people are trying to get information, even from other agencies. And then this year, because I know this course is really focused on thinking about food systems during the COVID pandemic, our work has looked a little different. We really kind of dropped a lot of our more traditional regulatory guidance and food safety training classes, and really started to look at what do our local farms and food businesses need right now in order to shift and adapt. We're going to look a little bit more at kind of a food system diagram and think about some of those what is encompassed in the food system and those supply chains. But if you can just imagine that prior to the pandemic, somewhere around 40% of the food that Americans consumed, we got through what's called food service channels. So restaurants, cafeterias, takeout, maybe the deli counter at the grocery store, but ready to eat food. So for nearly half of the food we ate, we were eating in those types of settings, which of course is everything that shut down in order to accomplish social distancing at the beginning of the pandemic. And so that massively disrupted supply chains for really every scale of farm and food business in the country. And I heard that the word of the year is pivot. And because that really is true, so many businesses and food businesses in particular really needed to pivot really quickly to figure out how to get their products to consumers in new ways. And when farmers markets were maybe not able to open, when restaurants were closed, when people were thinking about how could they deliver, everyone's wanting to buy food at home, so small farms are thinking about how could they deliver food directly to home residences. It was a lot of new shifts for small farms. So we looked at what we could do to support that with some small amounts of funding, trying to collaborate with other partners to get some more visibility in the marketplace with some marketing and promotions activities and some directories that were easily searchable so that consumers who were wanting to shop locally had an easier time of connecting with local farms. We also tried to help small and direct marketing farms that tend to not be as connected to existing federal government support programs. We tried to make sure they were aware of opportunities for relief and support and could compete for those opportunities. I apologize to the vegetarians and the vegans, but this is a reality of what small meat processing looks like. And in fact, with some of those disruptions in the supply chain, our local meat supply chain was really, really, really pressured. And the small scale producers who serve, processors who serve our local farmers were completely overwhelmed. And many times, small livestock producers will schedule a time to have their animals slaughtered and processed, a few months out. Well, this year they were needing to schedule that out 6 to 12 months in advance because there was so much demand from consumers who wanted to buy locally. They were not happy with how the national plants were operating, and they wanted to buy from local farms and local food supply chains that felt closer to home and more secure. And that just created a real pressure point on a lot of what are very, very small family businesses throughout the state. So we were able to run a grant to help support capacity for those, kind of a relief grant to help keep that running. So that's just kind of a sampling of what we do at regional markets, and in particular what we've done this year during COVID. Now I want to shift gears a little bit and start to talk more broadly about the food system and food policy. So this, you've probably seen a variety of diagrams of the food system. There's many of them out there. This is one that I like because it really kind of outlines these various categories of activity in the food system and all of the different sorts of ways that those activities are sort of impacted by resources and activities. So you can see, you know, obviously production. So that's farming that relies on all of these different types of resources. In order for that raw agricultural product to become something that consumers can eat, it often needs to go through some form of processing. At least it goes and it gets packaged differently, but often it's turned into some sort of value-added product. Those products need to be distributed. Consumers access food in all different types of ways. And that's one of the things we really seen changing with COVID is the primary ways in which consumers access food. I was mentioning previously, it was a lot through restaurants. Sadly, because of the economic impacts of people's employment closing down temporarily, many more people now are relying on accessing their food through food banks. We've had almost a 3- to 4-fold increase in demand at food banks in our state because of the impacts of COVID. But the takeaway really from this image is the food system is complex. It crosses all different types of resources, from natural and environmental resources to human resources, knowledge, physical infrastructure. There's a waste component, there's energy involved, it's complex. And the policies that regulate or manage, sort of contain that activity also span many agencies and many jurisdictions and sectors. So I just pulled together here an assortment of federal, state, and local government agencies that all are involved in making policies, have regulations, fund activities that impact food, how we make, process, distribute, access, and dispose of waste from food. So that's complex as well. There is no one Department of Food. At the federal level in the US, the USDA might be the closest to that, the Department of Agriculture, because it addresses production, agriculture, as well as many of our food access programs. So our National School Lunch Program, SNAP, sometimes known as food stamps, those are all managed within our department. Or some say it should be called the Department of Food and Agriculture. But a lot of our food safety regulation happens in another agency, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. And many of the rules and regulations that dictate how we manage the resources that go into agricultural production, like clean air, water, chemical usage, those are all managed by the Environmental Protection Agency, or not all, but many are. And then if you think about in the West in particular, where we have a lot of large rangeland, where cattle are able to graze, that land is managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And so you get the idea. Even in Washington State, a lot of our public health regulations fall under the jurisdiction of the Washington State Department of Health. But whether or not you could you build a like a small commercial kitchen on your farm, that actually might fall down to your local county planning department. So it's, again, the big takeaway here is it's complex, it's not unified. So when we talk about policy, and I'm curious if there's anyone taking this class who's really focused on a policy program or major, you may have a different or a very specific definition of this. But when I'm talking about policy today, I'm talking about it taking many different forms. So really policy is kind of more of a way of thinking of a plan that sets a framework for how actions are carried out. So if you think of policy in those terms, a policy could be a budget. It's dictating sort of how activities are happening. It could be the way a program is implemented. It could be sort of more traditional policy that we think of as sort of written policy in like legislation perhaps, but it could also be what gets researched and how is our education structured. And finally, recognition and promotion is maybe not so much a policy, but it's an incentive that motivates people. How are we going to be acknowledged for this great work that we're doing? Is something that people often think about and are motivated by. And obviously, there's a lot of interaction between these different sort of forms that policy can take in practice. So here's some examples of how this shapes these types of policies can shape food and agriculture. So as we've seen throughout COVID, one of the really important relief responses were low interest or forgivable loans, like the payroll protection program loan or small business administration loans. So grants and low-cost loans for farm businesses can essentially be a de facto policy for the types of farms that have the opportunity to be successful or the types of farm activities. Programs, I work with the Farm to School program. So that in effect is a way of, if we're supporting local school districts to be able to work with local farms, that's a program, but that's the fact that we're putting effort into it and supporting it is kind of a policy choice. Policy is really typically often thought of as like a procurement policy for an organization. They have rules they need to follow about how do they get bids to make a purchase using public dollars. That's a very formal policy, or zoning laws and development laws. So I think you get the idea here. So here's another food systems diagram. This one might be more like ones you've seen before. This slide right here, this image right here is really kind of what gets at the crux for me of food policy. So food policy really comes out of this state of complexity that we've been looking at here, that I've been describing, and recognizes that our food system is a system, and being able to think about it in a holistic, in a systems way, allows us to look at the interactions between policies that happen in one area of the food system and another. And so to understand that, if, for example, on the demand side, if we are interested in how consumers are able, or just households, individuals are able to access healthy and affordable food, say from Washington farmers, we also kind of want to understand how farmers in Washington state are challenged or supported in getting those healthy products to local consumers. And if we really are thinking about it that way, kind of a traditional way in America that we think about things as supply and demand in our sort of capitalist mindset, how does the supply side, what can we leverage or tweak or change on the supply side to influence how easy it is to access healthy local food on the demand side, and vice versa? So systems thinking allows for action and for look at in an interconnected system and looking at points of leverage. So when you take that type of a food systems approach to policy, you can actually see how you can start to spark like dynamic reinforcing sort of positive feedback loops. So if we are interested, and these here are actually, I've pulled, these are goals of the Washington State Food Policy Forum that were laid out for the forum by the Washington State Legislature. So if our goal is to increase access to healthy food for all Washingtonians, here are some ways, policies, programs that we might think about doing that. Farm to school and institutional procurement, programs that are incentives for low-income shoppers to be able to sort of double up or have more access to healthy fresh produce. So a great example of this is what we know here as Fresh Bucks, which allows folks who are shopping at farmers markets and using SNAP to access an additional $5 to use for purchasing local produce, as an example. That's an incentive program. So that's what those are some policies that we could create on the demand side, but what are the challenges that farms may have doing business, remaining economically viable? What types of policies and programs are needed on that side in order to make it so that farms are economically viable and can continue to grow and supply healthy food? So this kind of way of thinking is exactly why food policy councils or food policy networks have been forming. These have been an idea in North America anyway for probably 40 years. And they've had sort of various spurts in growth and popularity at different points. But really, since 2017, there has just, or excuse me, since the sort of 2010s, there's been just a huge growth in the number of food policy entities in North America. As of 2017, the Center for a Livable Future at Johns Hopkins University, which supports and monitors food policy councils, estimates that there's about 314 active food policy networks in North America. And these, you can see that growth, right? These food policy forums have some similarities and they have some variations. So one of the ways in which they can vary is the geography at which they operate. So many food policy councils are focused on sort of a city or a municipal level. Even more actually are focused on a county level. And I think that having worked on food policy councils at both the city and the county and now the state level, I think the reason that a lot of them are settling at that county level is because there's kind of a sweet spot there. In most counties, you have some semblance of a full system. Now, granted, our food system is global in many ways, but if you're looking at the county level, you often have some amount of agricultural production, some amount of food processing, you have some amount of consumers, and then you have all of the resource and waste issues that come along with it as well. So I think a county level tends to be kind of a coherent scale at which to think about food policy. Although personally, I'm loving working on it at the state level. That really feels like the sweet spot. And in fact, many of the newer food policy councils, there have been growth in food policy entities at the state scale, though still that is a minority. Some food policy councils are formed as nonprofit organizations. Many of them emerge from grassroots organizing, community members who are looking at a lot of that complexity and asking questions about why does it work this way and why do we not have anyone looking at this from a systems perspective? And they've organized and said, hey, local government, we would really like to engage with you to think about these issues more holistically. And so that's the way a lot of food policy work has happened. One thing they share in common is that they often really strive for broad membership representation And that can be defined in different ways, but usually it has some element of trying to have some representation across the different sectors of the food system. They can also vary in their relationship to government, and sometimes that it has implications for the type of activities they engage with. So the Washington State Food Policy Forum is actually fairly unique in the way in which it is so embedded in state government. It was created by the legislature. The legislature tasked the body to go and do this work. And it tasked two state agencies, the Washington State Department of Agriculture and the Washington State Conservation Commission, to co-convene and to appoint members to the forum. And so you'll see as I move ahead that a lot of the work that the Washington State Food Policy Forum does is really focused on making recommendations to the legislature. Whereas you may look at other food policy forums or food policy councils that are more municipally based, more grassroots oriented, might be a nonprofit organization and structure, and they may be much more focused on implementing projects in their local community. So there's wide diversity, but it's sort of diversity on a theme. All of those factors I just outlined can also can influence what types of priorities the different forums want to focus on. So you can see here, this is kind of a complex graphic, but these issues here down the left-hand side are ones that I think are fairly common topics that food policy forums or food policy councils look at. Certainly true for Washington State. So let's get into Washington State a little bit more specifically. So the Washington State Food Policy Forum, as I mentioned, is somewhat unique in some ways. It occupies a minority of those 300 plus food policy councils in North America, in that it operates at a statewide level, and it was created by the legislature in 2016, and it was specifically charged with making meaningful recommendations for improving the food system in Washington. No small task. And as I mentioned before, it charged two state agencies with convening a cross-sector group of food system stakeholders to consider and recommend and develop recommendations for the legislature. So the membership and representation is a cross-sector of the food system, but it definitely reflects the focus of the legislature in emphasizing issues of food access, healthy food access, and agricultural production. And so the membership, I think, is weighted a little bit heavily to entities and organizations that work in those two areas. It's funded with the state budget. So all of the members are volunteers. Members may represent small farm resource organizations. They may represent local county government, county agriculture programs, food banks, various state agencies, and including representatives. We have state senators and representatives who serve on an ex officio basis. These are the types of activities that the Food Policy Forum has identified that they're well suited to do. And this, I think, if you think back at some of those other types of food policy forums where they may have been really focused on implementing a program or doing a lot of advocacy organizing for sort of political gains, this body is a little bit different. It has state agencies involved, and state agencies are limited from doing that type of advocacy. And so the forum has really identified that its strengths are convening conversations, convening very diverse sectors of the food system to talk about issues from their various perspectives, coordinating, sharing information, developing policy recommendations, telling the stories of successes and challenges in the state, and being an influencer. And in fact, it is one of the few sort of boards or commissions, task forces at the state level that spans really such a wide geographic and sectoral diversity. There's a long ways to go in terms of diversity when we think in terms of structurally marginalized communities. And the forum has begun engaging in that conversation recently as well. But in terms of sectors of the food system, it's widely diverse. So I'm not going to read through all of these. There's a lot of text here, but these were the Food Policy Forum goals that the legislature essentially set out for the forum to address. There is a focus on supporting direct marketing farms and a focus on increasing consumption of Washington-grown food. So there is a focus on the local and regional food system. And number two, as I mentioned, these are kind of the two priority areas of the forum to really expand and promote programs that make healthy and nutritious Washington-grown foods available to more Washington residents. And sort of underneath those, there's a recognition that in order to achieve that, we need to be able to retain and cultivate new farmers. And a key part of that is ensuring that agriculture remains an economically viable sector. And that we have an overarching goal of reducing food insecurity and hunger. So the forum worked for many, many years, actually, to come up with a report to educate itself. It spent several years educating itself, learning from each other, and then came up with this kind of framework, which I think you'll recognize some of the similarity to some of those other food systems diagrams that we looked at. But the Food Policy Forum really decided that it was important for it to, in order to achieve those goals, for it to focus in these primary areas: processing, distribution, and aggregation, which gets at rural economic development, healthy food access, productive farmland, and that includes sort of both healthy natural resources, but also thinking about how to keep agricultural lands in agricultural production with the next generation of farmers. Access to markets, and in particular, making it easier for small scale and locally marketing farms to access local consumers. And then finally, sort of surrounding it all is this recognition that the impacts of climate change are critical to address. And there's arrows all over the place in this diagram, and that's really to represent that the forum recognized that the greatest and most effective progress is going to come from moving multiple food system recommendations in these different areas together. And that's really that holistic systems thinking approach that is unique and important to food policy thinking, food policy forums. So we came out with a report and submitted it to the legislature that includes 15 recommendations, big recommendations based on consensus for how to improve the food system. You are welcome to read it. It's linked. Maybe some of you have looked at it already. This is how the forum worked to achieve that outcome. As I mentioned, they started with a series of one-on-one discussions, inviting experts to come speak to them on different topics, educating each other. And then they distilled that down into prioritized food policy topics. Those are those 5 areas of focus that I mentioned. Then they broke into action working teams and really honed in and developed specific recommendations for action in each of those areas. So that was in 2019. 2020 opened with the coronavirus pandemic and real impacts for our food system locally and nationally. Trying to keep myself on track here. The forum was recognized as an entity that had been thinking about a lot of these issues pre-pandemic and was actually asked by the governor's office to take a special look at the food system and the impacts from COVID and make some recommendations for action and to sort of help make sense of it. And so the forum took its recommendations report and revisited it with the eyes of what they were seeing was happening in real time in the food system, and kind of refined those down to 4 primary challenges that they were recognizing, and then some opportunities for action in response. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to just sort of give some examples of the types of impacts that the coronavirus had. So obviously the stay-at-home order and the travel restrictions, social distancing requirements, et cetera, really increased existing access, barriers to access for nutrition assistance programs, especially for seniors and children who are participating in schools. So school meal programs, senior meal centers, those were all critical elements of sort of our food access safety network, and those needed to operate in a new way. Similarly, food banks rely almost entirely on volunteers, many of whom were at high-risk groups for contracting COVID. And so food banks needed to find entirely new ways to operate. School meal programs, which are empowered to serve in an emergency capacity to serve the community when we have a national emergency, but they're based on a congregate meal model where everyone comes to the school cafeteria to get fed. Of course, we could not do that during COVID. So the impacts were sweeping. At the same time, I mentioned earlier in the outset, the demand from the part of consumers for food closer to home, Washington grown, wanting to support local farmers in their communities, and also just a sense of security of having a tighter supply chain, and of course concerns about how workers are being treated throughout, and what we were asking them to do throughout the food supply chain led a lot of people to want to buy locally. And so that just created a lot of shifting and chaos. And we recognized that COVID was really threatening the economic viability of individual food and ag enterprises as they were struggling to adapt to this. And they really needed specific relief and relevant services to remain operational. And so the forum has made some recommendations about how to respond. Targeted business support services, specific cost shares and small grants that were offered maybe through the Small Business Administration program rather than through the Department of Ag, because a lot of the more local food and farming businesses don't have those relationships with the USDA lenders that bigger commodity farms really rely on. So it was the forum was recognizing that the channels to accessing these sorts of resources needed to be targeted to the need. I'm just going to run through these really quickly here. Another challenge was we didn't really have a lot of functional flexibility to shift readily. We have these fine-tuned supply chains that are designed to serve specifically the market that they're oriented to. So if you're serving a food service market, like think of a hospital kitchen that's making pans of scrambled eggs. And so the type of eggs that they need are already shelled, all ready to go in a plastic bag, just whip them up and make scrambled eggs for 100. That does not work for a household trying to buy eggs at the grocery store. And so if your egg supply chain was all designed towards serving that food service market, it takes a lot to shift, to package differently. Everything's the wrong size. All of those efficiencies are no longer efficient. So we recognize there was a need to look at that and think about ways to build in more flexibility and resiliency, and that in fact, in some cases, it was the local and smaller scale folks who were able to make those kinds of pivots more quickly, and that there was a certain amount of resilience and flexibility there that's important for us to look at going forward if we're wanting to recover from COVID with a more resilient food system. Finally, I mentioned earlier, one of the really hardships and difficulties of the COVID pandemic is that it has increased the need for access to nutrition services and food for so many more people. And just the logistical realities of trying to make sure people don't go hungry have been really, in some cases, overwhelming. And so there's a need to really look at the ways in which we deliver those nutrition services. You know, is it about relying and quickly mobilizing to get more food through food banks? Is it about increasing SNAP benefits or expanding those types of benefits to more individuals? How do we build in those positive reinforcement loops if we're needing to do a lot of government purchasing of food to make sure people don't go hungry? Can we also use that as opportunities to support our farmers and support farmers in ways that builds in resiliency and flexibility? So there are opportunities there that the Food Policy Forum looked at. And finally, of course, we recognized that while the pandemic itself was not necessarily a climate change emergency, that type of significant disruption and the resiliency that we have to respond to it has a lot of parallels to what we can come to expect as the climate continues to change. And that thinking about how do we make sure we're prepared for those changes from the natural resource perspective so that we can be flexible and adaptive. So those were sort of the many of the underlying vulnerabilities and challenges in our Washington State and national global food system that the Food Policy Forum had recognized in its 2019 report, but that were just highlighted in a completely new way and really exacerbated and made so much more visible throughout COVID-19 and the response to the pandemic. And of course, an entirely another layer of that became so much more visible was where we have existing inequities in our system. Those also became so much more exacerbated and visible. And the Food Policy Forum recognized that as well, and has begun to bring an equity lens. It's developing right now, an equity filter that they're going to be using to actually go back and look at their recommendations with an equity perspective and sort of guided by these types of questions. So that was sort of a whirlwind introduction and overview to the Washington State Food Policy Forum and food policy generally. Thanks for taking the time to listen, and I'll turn it back to you.
Laura, thank you so much. That was an incredible both breadth and depth, you know, both in terms of orienting us to this landscape of what you mean by food policy, what all the different permutations can be, and then really having a chance to dig into the details within Washington State, both from a broad perspective of wanting a strong food system here, but also dealing with the implications of the last year. So you covered so much. I want to end with just one quick question. It was a wonderful presentation. And I try to evoke the students, and I heard you say that food policy is complex, it's not unified, it's dynamic. And my first question was going to be, at some point, will we be able to stop pivoting and actually stabilize? But I'm going to just adjust that question a little bit to say, what gives you hope for resilience, if not stability? As we can assume that there will be more dynamic changes with climate change or with, other disasters that might strike. Where do you find hope for resilience and equity for our food system here in the state?
Well, I think, in the spring, now a year ago from now, when we were really first implementing all of these public safety measures, I was really concerned for our local food system. I did not I thought that the challenges would be more than a lot of our small farm and food businesses who often work with really tight profit margins, who are incredibly creative entrepreneurs, but don't have a lot of resources oriented to support them. I thought this is going to be it. I was really worried, I'll be honest. But in fact, that is not what has happened. So it's true that most of those businesses have received very little in terms of federal relief. I think our surveys have found it's like less than 10% of that type of business received any form of federal support throughout this. But they have been thriving. CSA farms that had diverse market channels, meaning they sold to restaurants, farmers markets, maybe had a CSA, were able to shift very quickly in the ways that those longer, more efficient supply chains were not able to. So local farms said, sure, we know how to deliver to neighborhoods. We have an email list that we can get people to pre-order and we'll do a pop-up in the neighborhood. We can triple our CSA membership and stay in business. It certainly has come at a cost of time and energy and worry and uncertainty and risk, but to really see that we were able to rely on our local food system in some ways to relieve some of the pressure as the rest of the national and global supply chain caught up with the pivot, to me points to the fact that there's a lot of lessons to be learned there that we can build on.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Let's end there. And hopefully we will continue to keep learning through this as we come out of this pandemic, and we'll have more lessons for the future. That was a great hopeful note to end on. Thank you so much for your time and for all the work that you do across the state. And we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks.